The portrait was finished on a Tuesday in late autumn 1763. The air hung heavy over the Dunston estate, the skies dim even at midday. The trees outside already bare, though no wind had yet touched them. The artist, a nervous man from Norwich with calloused fingers and a tremor in his left eye, packed his brushes and asked to be paid in coin, not credit. He had worked for many families before, but never one so still. Lady Rosamond Dunston had not blinked once during sittings. Her husband, Lord Ambrose, moved only to adjust the lapel of his son's jacket. The children said nothing. Even when they smiled, their teeth did not show. The painter had tried to capture their likeness with honesty. But the final result unnerved him, not because it looked unnatural, but because it didn't. It looked too real, as if something had been pulled out of the canvas and left behind in the room. He delivered the piece to the drawing room above the western parlor. They paid him, then walked him to the front steps with kindness that felt like dismissal. He did not look back. The portrait was tall, almost the height of the doorframe. It showed the entire family seated in a crescent, all turned slightly toward the youngest daughter, who held a red silk ribbon in her hand. No one could explain why she held it. She had not held it during the sessions. But it was there, draped over her pale fingers, the end tucked beneath her father's polished boot. The background was a blend of muted stone and sky, faint silhouettes of towers in the far distance. The painting was hung without ceremony, but over time it began to draw notice, not admiration, because something about it changed, not suddenly, not violently, but undeniably. Visitors who came for supper remarked first on the colors. The once soft gray of the sky darkened with each season. The shadows beneath the chairs deepened. The crimson of the ribbon began to fade, then darken again, but unevenly, as if the pigment was absorbing something. But the most unsettling part was this: none of the Dunstons seemed to age. The children, who should have grown taller, stayed small and quiet. Their hair never lost its luster. Their cheeks never hollowed. One maid whispered that she'd polished the same boots for 10 years, and the leather had never cracked. Lady Rosamond's skin, pale as china, never creased at the eyes or mouth. Her reflection in the glass never changed. And neither did the one in the portrait. Servants stopped walking past the drawing room after dark. They said they heard tapping behind the canvas. Others claimed the eyes of the children followed them, not with malice, but with unbearable stillness, as if waiting for something. Then came the disappearances. First a housemaid named Elsie, who dusted the portrait daily. Then the stable boy, then a new nurse hired to care for the youngest Dunston child, who by 1770 still hadn't spoken a word in public. No screams were ever heard, no blood found, just rooms left with the beds made, wash basins still warm, a comb with fresh hair resting on the sill. The Dunstons expressed concern, offered pay to grieving families, and always kept the portrait covered with a fine cloth during such visits. When the cloth was lifted again, the painting always seemed darker, not ruined, not damaged, just less light in the faces, less space in the air between them. By 1780, the west wing of the estate was sealed. Lord Ambrose ordered it closed after what he described as an infestation of damp. No workers were allowed to assess it, no mason summoned. When a chimney sweep wandered in by mistake, he was dismissed without pay. He claimed to have seen small doors along the interior walls of the corridor. each no taller than a child's chest. He said the floors were lined with ash, and in one of the rooms a thin wire strung from the ceiling, with something dangling at its end, still moving. He was told never to speak of it again. Within 2 months he was dead, crushed between 2 carriages in a quiet alley. The coroner noted that his spine had snapped so cleanly it looked surgical. Downstairs, the family continued to host guests. They laughed softly, served wine, played music no one could quite place, melodies that never resolved. Yet always that same painting remained untouched high on the wall in the drawing room. By 1792, the colors had shifted so thoroughly that one visiting magistrate insisted it must be a new commission. The children appeared the same age, but their postures had changed, slightly more rigid. Their heads tilted differently. One child's hand, the one that had once rested on the arm of her mother, now hung limp at her side. The silk ribbon once held in the girl's hand now trailed loosely across the floor. Scholars have debated how a painting could change, whether pigments could oxidize in such patterns, whether the brushstrokes had ever truly dried. But those who lived inside the estate knew better. They had seen the shadow beneath the frame grow longer at night. They had noticed how the floorboards directly below it had begun to soften, as though absorbing something too heavy to hold. Some said the portrait was feeding. Others said it was hiding. But one thing was certain: the Dunstons did not age, and the longer the portrait stayed, the more the house felt like it had sealed itself from time. The children sat together often but never touched. 3 of them, Honora, twins Edmund and Ellis, and little Beatrice, always the smallest, arranged daily in the blue parlor, their chairs facing the wide windows that let in only enough light to cast long, dragging shadows on the floor. They did not play, they did not bicker, they did not blink. Guests began to notice first. An ambassador's wife, after watching the children during a spring gathering in 1766, remarked to her husband that they behaved like dolls propped for display. The mother, Lady Rosamond, only smiled and explained it was discipline. The Dunston children were trained to sit in stillness as a virtue. But as the hours passed, even the most generous observer could not ignore the truth. The eyes did not water, the lids did not flutter. A full hour passed as music played in the salon, and the Dunston children did not blink once. The ambassador's wife vomited in the corridor before departure. She would later describe the experience as being watched by the dead who hadn't yet learned they were gone. Servants spoke of stranger things, of how each child, when alone, would turn slowly to face the sound of breath. Not footsteps, not voice, only breath. That if you exhaled too near them, they would lean forward as if tasting the air. One kitchen maid swore she saw the youngest, Beatrice, rock in perfect rhythm with the grandfather clock's second hand, her lips twitching each time the tick sounded, as if remembering a word she'd been told never to say. The new governess arrived that winter. Miss Porton, quiet, strict, selected carefully after the previous one left without collecting her final pay. She had taught noble children before, knew how to instill posture and poise. But within days she felt a chill around the children that could not be explained by temperament. They did not respond to correction. They did not respond to praise. When asked a question, they either stared or answered in unison, always in 5-word sentences. Never more, never less. Their handwriting was flawless, their arithmetic precise, but none of them seemed to know how to draw anything not already inside the house. Every sketch was of their own rooms, of each other, of chairs and halls and doorknobs, but never trees, never animals, never anything alive. One morning, Miss Porton rose earlier than usual, disturbed by a noise that felt too slow to be footsteps but too deliberate to be wind. It came from the north wing, long abandoned and supposedly sealed. She followed it barefoot, her candle shaking in the dark, and found the door ajar. It groaned open as if the hinges had not moved in years, but inside was a room untouched by dust. At the center, a rocking chair. In it, a girl, small, eyes wide open, chest unmoving. It was Beatrice, but not as she had seen her before. Her mouth was stitched shut with black thread, coarse, not clean. The thread did not loop in delicate knots, but jagged, uneven pulls. Miss Porton leaned in, sickened, and saw strands of something thick woven into the thread. Not wool. Not silk, hair, black human hair, frayed and graying at the ends. The girl's eyes did not blink. Miss Porton screamed and fled the room, and when she returned with help, the chair was empty. The door locked, and Beatrice was seen that same afternoon seated by the hearth, unmarked, sipping broth with her siblings in silence. Miss Porton packed her things that night. She told no one. She left through the servants' gate and made it as far as the village inn. She did not speak of what she'd seen, only requested ink and paper and locked herself in her room. Hours passed, then silence, then nothing. They found her body at dawn the next day, face down in the well behind the inn. Her skin was bloated, but her face had not yet swollen. Her eyes were wide, the pupils entirely gone. Scooped or cut, it was unclear. Her fingernails had black ink beneath them, and the well itself ran black for hours after she was removed. The physician who examined her said the liquid in her lungs was not water, but ink thickened with bone powder. On her stomach, words scratched faintly into the skin with what appeared to be a quill nib. They do not blink because they do not sleep. The Dunstons sent condolences. No investigation followed. Inside the estate, nothing changed. The children resumed their routines. Lady Rosamond said the governess had left for family reasons. A replacement was hired within the week. She lasted 3 days. She did not see what Miss Porton saw, but she woke once to find all 4 children standing beside her bed, unmoving, eyes wide. When she screamed, they scattered, soundlessly, mechanically, like chairs pushed by an unseen hand. Some say the children had been experimented on. Others claimed they had never been children at all, that they were born from silence, raised in stillness, and trained not to grow, but to remain. Rumors spread that in the locked west wing, a room full of mirrors once reflected 4 small chairs that rocked on their own. That inside one of those mirrors a 5th child could be seen, always stitched, always watching, always waiting to replace one of the others when they blinked. But none ever did. The journals were bound in calfskin, stitched with red thread, and sealed in a locked chest behind the chapel hearth. They were found in 1838 during renovations, long after the Dunston estate had been abandoned, the fire having gutted the eastern wing and left the rest crumbling with damp. The chest itself was unmarked except for a single brass plate that read, "For those who understand that movement is hunger." Inside were 9 volumes, each identical in size, filled with precise, narrow script. Lord Ambrose Dunston had recorded everything, Not just his observations, not just his theories, but his commandments. The doctrine that ruled his family, his house, and every breath taken within its walls. He believed the body decayed because it moved too much, that the skin cracked because it shifted with emotion, that aging was not time's doing but the soul's inability to remain still. He wrote that grief pulled the face downward, that laughter widened the eyes too often, that fear made the breath jagged and the bones brittle. To stay young, one had to learn stillness, not the passive kind, but the kind built through pain, controlled, imposed. He believed silence alone was not enough. It had to be trained into the limbs, buried into the joints, hardened into marrow. Each child born into the Dunston family was raised under what he called the Stasis Protocol. The first stage began in infancy, breath-holding trials that increased by seconds each week. The nurses were instructed not to soothe when the child cried, but to time the intervals between gasps. They logged the duration of each scream until the scream stopped. The second stage was muscular stasis, long hours spent bound gently but persistently, arms and legs wrapped in soft wire to discourage twitching. The joints were cooled with tinctures made from lavender and powdered glass to slow circulation. Infants who struggled were removed from the protocol and retired to wax. The phrase appears 19 times in the journals. No further explanation is given. As the children grew, the rituals deepened. Each morning they stood in front of the family portrait for exactly 40 minutes. Not to observe, but to mimic. They were to match the posture of their painted selves perfectly, no slouching, no shifting of weight. Each gesture that deviated was recorded in a ledger. After 3 deviations, the child was sent to the reflection room, a chamber lined with mirrors that reflected only the child's faults. Inside, according to Ambrose's own words, they were instructed to observe the chaos they carry and return whole. But it was the third stage that horrified the archivists most: emotive extraction. Ambrose believed that emotion, if left uncorrected, would calcify in the face and expose the soul. To counter this, he developed a technique using warm wax and linen strips. Children were encouraged to express an emotion, fear, sadness, rage, and at the peak of that expression, wax was poured gently over the face to capture it. The child remained still until the mold cooled. The wax was then peeled away and catalogued. Each mold was stored in the West Wing archive, along a corridor known only as the Gallery of Failures. Ambrose referred to them as emotive husks, evidence that the soul had not yet conformed. One wax mask bore teeth cracked from clenching. Another had eyes sealed shut in terror. The archivist who catalogued the remains found over 40 such masks. Not all had names. Several children did not survive the trials. Ambrose noted this with the same detachment he used to discuss dust accumulation. He wrote, "Some vessels burst under pressure. They are returned to matter without judgment." One journal contained anatomical sketches, not of adults, but of children aged 6 to 12. Each sketch highlighted the same regions: spine, jaw, throat. Beside them were notations: tracheal flinch upon joy, mandible loosened by surprise, lacrimal overactivity during shame. He believed every emotion was a deformity of flesh. The cure was not surgery, it was stillness. He referenced historical precedents, Egyptian death rituals, medieval anchor rites, Prussian restraint therapy. He admired Queen Charlotte's quiet, Children theorized that their calm was not genetic, but imposed. He cited letters from a French surgeon who had studied with Mesmer and described how magnetism might quiet the inner tide. He expressed interest in experiments on freezing nerves with salt brine. He planned to install a chamber filled with ice to preserve a child mid-expression. The last entry in the 9th journal reads only, "The ice cracked before she did." By the time the journals ended, the family's lineage had already withered. Cousins died young. Visitors stopped coming. The children who survived, if they could be called that, were barely seen beyond the estate grounds. The portrait remained, untouched. Each year it looked less like a painting and more like a memory being forcibly preserved. Lord Ambrose Dunston did not describe his actions as punishment. He believed he was saving them, not from death but from change. The enemy was time, and his weapon against it was stillness crafted through suffering. What he created was not a family, it was an exhibit, a ritual made of blood, bone, and breath held too long. The hour room was never meant to be found. For decades it lay beneath the Dunston estate, sealed behind mortar and rot, its presence hinted only by drafts that carried no source, and by the way footsteps above sometimes echoed with a hollow second delay. In 1809, during repairs after a storm split one of the great oaks in the garden and cracked the foundation wall, workers pried loose a slab of stone and uncovered a stairwell curling into blackness. The air that rose from it was not foul, not damp, but dense, like breath that had been held too long. They descended, lanterns shaking in their hands, and found what the Dunstons had hidden. A chamber shaped like a clock with no face. A circle of walls without time, filled with objects that spoke of method and madness in equal measure. Clocks lined the chamber, but none bore hands. They were carved from oak, copper, and bone, their faces smooth and pale, their pendulums swinging without sound. Some ticked but measured nothing. Others were frozen mid-swing, as if waiting for permission to continue. On the floor were cages, not locked but latched inward, as though designed to keep something in, not by force but by trick. The doors opened freely, yet closed without allowing escape. They were sized too small for grown men, but too deliberate to be anything but human in purpose. And along the walls stood chairs, carved not for comfort, but confinement. Their measurements matched the growth of children, spindles shaped for spines at varying lengths, seats so shallow only small bodies could rest there. The arms curved inward unnaturally, pressing toward the chest, forcing the sitter to bow. Some bore stains that had seeped too deep to fade, a dark glaze along the wood grain that no polish could disguise. At the center of the chamber lay the copper tube, 6 feet long, sealed at both ends, dulled green with age. When struck with the base of a lantern, it rang not hollow but strangled, like a voice pressed against metal. The men argued whether to open it, and finally one brave soul unbolted the rim. What spilled out was not dust but fragments. A girl's skeleton fused and malformed, her spine bent in an arch so severe it seemed sculpted rather than natural. Her jaw had split down the center, cracked wide and held there by time. Her tiny fingers were curled inward, nails embedded into the bone of her own palms as if she had clawed herself silent in her final hour. There were no clothes, no coffin. Just her inside the copper, sealed tight like a specimen meant not for burial but for study. In the journals discovered later, Lord Ambrose wrote of her. He called her the last hour. He believed she had been chosen to embody the doctrine of stillness to its perfect end. He described how she was placed in the tube with her back braced by heated rods until her spine fused into submission. Each day the rods were tightened a fraction, forcing her posture further until bone and metal became one. She was forbidden to breathe deeply, commanded to sip air in controlled increments timed by the clocks above her head. When she screamed, the sound reverberated in the tube, looping back until it broke her own jaw. Ambrose wrote that the silence that followed was proof of containment. To him, her suffering was evidence that the human body, if pushed past breaking, could be frozen in eternal stillness. The hour room contained more than her remains. Wax molds lined the walls, faces captured mid-expression, mouths pulled open too wide, eyes twisted upward as though rolled back by force. Each mask bore scratches inside, grooves from teeth and nails pressed into wax before it cooled. These were not keepsakes. They were trophies, proof that the soul could be extracted one expression at a time. A set of iron braces hung nearby, designed to clamp the jaw open until muscles tore. A copper basin stood beneath, stained black, as though it had once caught something thicker than water. What unsettled the workers most was not the evidence of torture, but the sense of design. None of this had been cobbled together in haste. It was meticulous, ritualistic. Every clock placed to measure nothing but to remind those inside that time itself had been removed. Every cage shaped not to hold animals, but to train children in confinement without locks. Every chair fitted to force the body into an unnatural imitation of stillness. The room was not a dungeon, it was a classroom, and its lessons were pain. When word of the discovery reached the authorities, they sealed the chamber without report. The Dunstons were untouchable by name and wealth. The workers who had opened the copper tube were paid and dismissed. One never slept again, his nights plagued by the echo of something screaming inside metal with no mouth to carry it. Another drank himself blind within a year. The third vanished, leaving only a note scrawled in charcoal. She is still in the clocks. She ticks without eyes. Above ground, the family portrait remained unchanged. But some claimed that after the hour room was opened, one could see a faint glint of copper in the background, just behind the youngest child's chair. And if you stared long enough, you might notice her jaw, not quite closed, not quite whole, as if remembering the last hour she had lived. The conservatory had always felt colder than the rest of the house, even when the sun bore down on the greenhouse glass and the surrounding rooms choked on heat. Servants avoided it unless ordered, the light too strange there, too gold in the morning, too blue at dusk. The air was thick with lavender and beeswax, but the flowers were long dead, their vases dry. Inside the main hall of the conservatory stood the figures, over 3 dozen, arranged not in a line or circle but in subtle gestures of daily life. A man reaching for a pocket watch, a child mid-curtsy, a woman kneeling, head bowed, palms open as if in prayer or surrender. They were lifelike enough to fool at first glance, but on second something went hollow, not in the form, but in the silence that surrounded them, the kind of silence that expects you to answer. Each figure was carved in wax, but not all the way through. Beneath the layers of candle-soft flesh there was something else. The first clue came when a new groundskeeper, sweeping out rain-blown leaves, brushed against one of the figures and felt heat, not warmth from the sun, heat from within. The wax along the arm had softened, and beneath the layer a fragment of jawbone peeked through. When the overseer pressed further, the wax cracked and a molar fell loose. Real, human, polished but uncut, still rooted. Within the hour, the room was locked. The Dunston steward ordered silence. The figure was sealed in tar cloth, removed to the cellar. But a former maid, older now, called in to assist in record-keeping, froze when she saw the face. She trembled, stepped closer, and whispered one word. Jonas. He had been a footman, gone 17 years. Young, kind, known for humming while he worked. The same dimple in the cheek, the same notch at the brow from a riding accident. It was him, perfectly posed in candle wax. But Jonas had disappeared, they'd said. Moved north, married. The record said so. Now the record burned quietly in the fireplace as the wax figure cooled in the cellar. Not all the figures were identifiable, but several bore marks of familiarity. One had the ring of a long-dead governess. Same ribbon, same posture. Another bore the laced boots of a groundskeeper lost during the winter flood of '64. But what bound them together wasn't resemblance. It was their mouths. Each figure, when examined closely, had human molars embedded along the gum line, precisely spaced, sunken into soft wax like fossilized memory. A few had full rows. Others had fragments. One figure had only teeth, no tongue, no lips, just a mouth filled edge to edge with mismatched enamel. The room, it seemed, was a museum of silences. People not memorialized but preserved, posed to suggest continuity, denied movement forever. A ledger was found tucked beneath the drawing table in the back of the conservatory, sealed with a wax emblem shaped like a curled spine. Inside, recipes. Not for meals, but for preservation. Wax mixed with beeswax, yes, but also bone ash taken from adolescent femurs for flexibility. And something else. A resin, clear and hardening, extracted through a process that involved spinal taps conducted post-mortem or during unconsciousness. The fluid was boiled, skimmed, and blended into the wax to retain essence. The notation was precise. Resin stabilizes expression, preserves moment of identity loss. Below it an equation, weight of fluid to wax, ratio of bone to heat. Written not as art, but as formula. Lord Ambrose, it seemed, had taken the doctrine of stillness beyond the living. He no longer sought compliance through silence alone. He wanted obedience after death, immobility that endured. Every figure in that room had once been someone who spoke, who moved, who refused. And so he took from them what time could not, their posture, their gaze, their last moment of resistance molded into obedience. It was said the conservatory glowed at night, that the wax figures caught moonlight differently, their shadows bending in the wrong direction. That if you pressed your ear close to their chests, you'd hear faint cracking. Not from melting, but from settling, like bone rearranging itself under pressure. Some believed that the figures were still soft inside, that the resin had failed, that their mouths behind the wax still tried to open. One wax child was found toppled after a storm. Her figure cracked down the center, revealing a hollow cavity filled with ribboned hair and salt. The teeth had been stitched into the gums using thread, not tied, stitched, like a doll being made backward. After the estate was abandoned, the conservatory was sealed, but reports of sounds from inside persisted. A letter from a constable in 1892 described finding melted wax pooling at the threshold despite no fire. Another from a surveyor spoke of footprints in cooled wax, child-sized, barefoot, trailing from the door to the garden and ending at a tree whose trunk had been hollowed out. Those who studied the ledger noticed that every resin blend required one final element, a subject willing to be still during molding. But willingness, in Ambrose's terms, did not mean consent. It meant defeat. And once that moment came, that exact second when a person stopped struggling, when the last breath left without purpose, he considered it readiness. They were molded warm. That's why one figure had still been warm to the touch, because he hadn't waited long enough. He arrived each year in early spring, always alone, always unannounced, but never unexpected. The servants of the Dunston estate knew to prepare a room in the west wing, the one that remained locked all other months. It was cleaned the week before, its sheets pressed and its instruments polished. Not medical, not surgical in the ordinary sense, but objects that made no sound when used. Dr. Leonid Fenwick stepped down from his carriage dressed in wool, his shoes unlaced, his coat covered in ash as if he had walked through a fireplace. His eyes were a color that shifted with the light. No one remembered where he came from. Some said he was Prussian, others whispered Swiss, but all agreed that he did not age. Not in the way others did. His beard never grew. His hands never shook, and around his neck always was the locket. The locket was oval, flat, and made of blackened brass that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It bore no emblem, no initials, only a notch at the bottom where a fingernail could pry it open. Inside were not portraits but fragments, 12 in total, each secured in a thin casing of wax. A fingernail pale as milk, an eyelash curled and still clinging to skin, a tiny incisor stained faintly red at the root. No names, no dates. Just a silent catalogue of what he considered sacred. The children, he once told Ambrose Dunston, were not patients. They were subjects of interruption, lives paused before they could be ruined by memory. Dr. Fenwick's treatments were designed to sever the body's link to time. He believed that memory lived in breath and movement, and that if one could unlearn how the body measured hours, one could be preserved. His most gentle method was called subdermal threading, a process where thin strands of heated sinew were inserted beneath the skin of the arms and legs to tighten muscle groups and restrict reflex. The threads were pulled taut around key joints, especially the knees and elbows, to hold the limbs in softened stillness. The patient was not restrained. They simply ceased to reach. For more advanced subjects, he administered what he termed organ fasting. Certain organs, he claimed, were more corruptible by time: the stomach, the lungs, the bowels. These were to be rested. His patients were fed nothing for days, then only broth, then breath itself, measured in increments. One servant watched a child under Fenwick's care lie in a copper cradle with padded restraints, breathing through a narrow tube. Her ribs moved only once every 20 seconds. He believed this cycle trained the organs to operate without hunger, without urgency. The child did not cry. Her skin turned gray. By the 4th day, she stopped moving. Fenwick recorded her final breath in his journal as successfully disobedient to time. She was not buried, but it was his optical procedures that most disturbed the staff. He called it vision reversal. Using lenses shaped from bent copper and smoked glass, Fenwick forced his subjects to wear spectacles that distorted space. Up was down, left was right, movement blurred and twisted. They wore them for weeks, even in sleep. He claimed that when the eyes saw time backward, the mind would forget how to track it. Some children adapted. Some vomited until they passed out. One boy gouged out his own eyes with a spoon. Fenwick praised his instinct. The boy was later cast in wax. Fenwick did not raise his voice. He did not use restraints. His power came not from cruelty, but from patience. He believed suffering was not useful unless controlled, and that pain delivered too quickly taught nothing. One servant who fled the estate after witnessing a session described seeing a girl curled on a table with her mouth stitched shut. Not by thread, but by fine copper wire woven through her lips and then soldered to a small plate embedded in her collarbone. The wire was connected to a pendulum. With each breath, the pendulum swung, and when she breathed too quickly, it choked her. He kept a journal of the locket's contents. Though he never named the 12 children, he described their traits in cold detail. Subject 3. Emotional decay at 6 months. Subject 6. Auditory defiance during fasting. Subject 9. Eyes moved independently during silence. He wore the locket like a relic, tapping it once each morning and once before treatment, as though it contained the blueprint for how stillness should feel. In his final visit to the estate, he stayed longer than usual, nearly 6 weeks. During that time, the conservatory was sealed. No staff entered. Several children were noted as away for rest. When the doors reopened, 3 wax figures had been added to the collection, each with copper wiring coiled beneath the skin. None had eyes. Dr. Fenwick departed without farewells. His carriage vanished into a fog that did not touch the fields beyond the estate. Years later, a physician matching his description appeared in early records of a Berlin institution that specialized in sensory deprivation for war orphans. He was never named, but a surviving document listed a consulting gentleman who introduced stillness therapy. His patients did not survive long. Back at the Dunston estate, the West Wing remained quiet. The wax figure stayed warm for days after his departure, and the locket, they said, was left behind, hanging from the smallest rocking chair, unopened, humming faintly like something inside still breathed. He arrived late in the summer of 1801, a distant cousin from Essex named Malcolm Everley, invited more out of formality than affection. The Dunstons did not often host family anymore. Their gatherings had thinned over the decades, their lines of relation reduced to formal letters and unsigned gifts. But Ambrose said the cousin might prove useful. Someone outside the household to test the portrait's hold. Malcolm was a man of numbers and habit, known to speak only when sure. He arrived with a satchel, a brass watch, and a polished pair of spectacles, his clothes stiff from starch. The housekeeper noted he blinked frequently, as if fearful of missing something. The portrait still hung in the drawing room untouched by dust, its colors as strange and shifting as ever. Candlelight made the shadow seem deeper now, and the figures within looked less like a family and more like reflections trapped in old stone. The youngest girl, Beatrice, sat on the far right of the canvas, ribbon in hand, gaze turned slightly outward, never quite meeting the eye but never fully looking away. Malcolm stood before her for nearly 20 minutes during his first night. When asked what he saw, he hesitated, then muttered, "Her eyes don't match the paint." He refused to explain. 2 nights later, during supper, he dropped his fork. His hands trembled. He excused himself, then returned to the drawing room alone. He stood in front of the portrait again, closer this time, just inches from the girl's face. And then he shouted. Not from fear, but from certainty, he swore, clear and trembling, that the girl in the portrait had blinked. Not in a flicker or shimmer, not a trick of the light. A full, deliberate blink. Her lids lowered, paused, then opened again. He saw moisture in her eyes. He said her mouth moved a little, as if trying to remember how to shape a word. The family said nothing. Ambrose stood and walked him calmly to his room, speaking softly, as if trying to soothe the fever. The next morning, Malcolm was gone. His room was untouched, the bed unslept. But on the chair beside the window, his vest was neatly folded. And inside its lining, stitched by hand, were 2 human eyelids, perfectly preserved, their lashes intact. The stitching was careful, precise, the thread a shade too dark for cotton, more like tendon than fabric. The lids were sewn to face outward, as if they had been placed to keep watch even in absence. A formal report was never made. Malcolm's belongings were boxed, his name unspoken. But a new anxiety spread through the estate, quiet and inward. Servants began to avoid the drawing room entirely. The children, now teenagers in body if not in time, were no longer seen passing by the portrait. Some whispered that the girl in the painting had shifted, that her eyes now followed with more clarity, her skin slightly less still than before. One night a storm knocked loose part of the chapel's foundation. A mason arrived to assess the damage. While inspecting the space beneath the altar, he struck something soft beneath the floor. Not rot, not earth. Wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath a stone that bore no marking, he found a hand. Small, mummified, but unmistakably human. The fingers curled slightly inward as if caught mid-motion. The skin was gray but pliant, not yet leathered, still soft. The hand had no body, no matching limb, no records of burial. But what unnerved him more was what followed. That evening, the family gathered in the drawing room. Candlelight flickered against the portrait. A servant, tasked with trimming the wicks, paused and whispered something she would never repeat. When pressed, she simply said, "There's a space now." They looked. And there it was. The girl's right hand, the one that once held the ribbon, was gone from the canvas, not blurred, not faded, gone. The sleeve now ended just past the wrist. The ribbon hung loose. Ambrose claimed it was an error in varnish, that exposure to smoke or moisture had warped the paint. But when the painting was examined by lamplight, the canvas showed no damage, just absence. The girl's gaze remained more fixed than ever. Her lips tighter, but her hand was missing. A journal entry from Ambrose, found years later tucked into the back of a book on anatomy, confirmed more than it denied. He wrote, "We are wrong to think the body decays from within. It is the gaze of others that unthreads us. She blinked because he saw. The hand disappeared because he named it." The portrait, he believed, was not a record, it was a tether. Each brushstroke tied to obedience, each figure painted into stillness, not by art, but by agreement. The moment that agreement broke, when someone saw movement, the cost was paid. And the portrait took back what it had once loaned. In the weeks that followed, the estate grew quieter. Servants requested reassignment. Visitors stopped coming. The hand was never replaced. The ribbon dragged now across the painted floor, a loose thread dangling like the end of something long unraveled. The figure of Beatrice no longer seemed passive. She seemed aware, less posed, more patient. Some believed the hand beneath the chapel had been buried as a warning. Others said it was a result, the portrait defending itself from disruption. But a few, those who had served longest, believed something far worse. That the portrait was not changing, it was correcting. That it remembered what the family tried to forget, and that those who saw too much would be stitched apart until they could not see at all. The orchard never grew as it should. Despite the estate's size and age, the trees remained stunted, their fruit too sweet and their bark too smooth. Gardeners came and went, each with a theory. The soil too soft, the air too damp, the drainage too poor. But none dared dig deep. The Dunstons were particular about their land, especially the small square of orchard closest to the west wing. It was said to have been planted by Lady Rosamond herself, though she was never once seen with soil under her nails. The trees bore apricots, pears, plums, all unusually pale, their skins almost translucent in the light. Visitors often commented on the flavor. Overripe, honeyed, cloying. The kind of sweetness that lingered at the back of the throat like grief. In 1810, after a lightning strike split the central tree, workers were sent to remove the roots. They dug into the earth and found it unusually compacted, not with clay or stone, but with something denser, something that clinked beneath the spade. They uncovered a pattern, not random, not scattered, but deliberate. Bones, not whole skeletons, but fragments. Femurs mostly. Infant femurs no longer than a hand's length, split vertically down the center and hollowed. Inside each bone was a fine gray powder. When disturbed, it rose like ash, but settled heavier like pigment. The bones were laid in lines branching from a single central knot of thicker bone and marrow, like the root system of a tree mapped in reverse. 12 lines, 12 root paths, all radiating from the base of the orchard. The workers reported it, of course, and were dismissed by nightfall. In the weeks that followed, no more fruit grew from the trees. The leaves browned at the tips and the trunks cracked open in thin, silent seams. The family ordered no repairs. No new trees were planted. The ground, they said, was resting. But Ambrose's notes tell a different story. In a torn page from his later journal, he writes, "We fed the soil too fast. The pigment seeped unevenly. The portrait may warp." Another entry scrawled in haste, "Flesh must be prepared before transition. Children born too loud spoil the mixture." He had been using the orchard not to grow, but to cure. The infant bones buried beneath were not disposed. They were transformed, their marrow drained and dried, their powder mixed with oils and minerals. He called it root pigment. Records recovered from the chapel storage room reveal recipes: blood-thickened linseed oil, powdered marrow ash, and sun-warped bone fragments crushed to dust. This was not theory. It was practice. He had turned body into color. The portrait, it seemed, was not painted once and left to dry. It had been touched again and again, layer by layer, with materials no sane artist would ever mix. Beneath the topmost oils, the underpainting showed shifts. Redefined expressions, slightly changed angles, subtle corrections in the position of hands and eyes, each revision marked with a note in Ambrose's hand. Adjusted for stillness, stilled mouth further, reduced uninvited motion. The portrait aged like a living thing, fed not by time but by what the soil beneath the orchard gave back. The orchard wasn't just burial, it was processing. The bodies of infants, not miscarried, not lost to illness, but taken, were broken deliberately, the bones arranged not with respect but with precision. A pigment map, a ritual design. It was said that on nights when the moon sat directly over the center tree, the fruit would drip a red so faint it vanished by morning. No one picked fruit after midnight. A former servant, aged and near death, confessed in writing that she had once assisted with the mixing. She hadn't known what the powder was, only that it came in sealed jars and was labeled by number, never name. She stirred it into oils while Ambrose painted alone, always humming. When she asked once about the color, he told her it was called still heart, a shade not found in nature, only in silence. By 1815, the orchard had gone fully dormant. The portrait, by contrast, grew darker in tone. The children within looked more rigid, their skin a color that no longer matched the light in the room. Their clothes appeared weighted, their eyes glistened as if under glass. One guest said the canvas looked less like oil and more like pressed skin. He left the estate that same night, pale and trembling, muttering that the frame was not nailed to the wall but grown into it. Under the chapel floor, more bone was found. Not infant this time, but small hands fully formed, each clutching something, a piece of stained fabric, a wax bead, a slice of ribbon. One hand held a brush tip, its bristles stiff with dried paint. Another was fused into a cup of silver etched with Ambrose's initials. These were not random burials. These were tools, parts repurposed, buried near where pigment was ground. Instruments, not remains. Ambrose's final note in the orchard ledger read, "The portrait consumes only what is stilled. A twitch ruins the base. A scream stains the layer. We must pour gently." The portrait remains in the drawing room, unaged, unflaked. Conservators later called it impossibly well preserved. But those who studied it long enough began to see things beneath the visible layers. Shapes, shadows, fragments of gestures erased but not fully gone. Like bones beneath soil. Waiting. By 1831, the estate was long silent, its ashes scattered not by wind but by order. No name remained on the land deed. No plaque marked where children once sat petrified in chairs molded to their still-forming bones. The story of the Dunston family did not end in fire. It ended in omission. Parliament convened that spring under the guise of moral reform, drawing up a bill with sterile words and no names. The Preservation of Child Anatomy Act. It outlawed the possession of juvenile remains for use in art, medical study, or private science. It passed without debate. But it was not written to prevent harm. It was written to avoid having to name what had already been done. Behind closed doors, officials whispered what could not be recorded, that private estates had for years served as laboratories, that the Dunstons had not been alone, that somewhere between the ambitions of medicine and the ego of aristocracy there had emerged a quiet belief that children were vessels, malleable, mute, and filled with the rawest potential, that stillness preserved not just their bodies but something rarer, a state between life and death, a purity untouched by agency. Though the law was passed, no charges were filed, no family was summoned. The Dunstons had vanished from the legal world as if they had never been born into it. Their birth records were missing. Parish ledgers bore scratched lines where christenings once appeared. Even land taxes were redirected, the estate now listed as crown property reserved for agricultural review. But the portrait remained, not in a museum, not in a gallery. in a sealed archival room beneath the Royal College of Physicians. It hangs still. Candlelight no longer graces its surface. The room is lit only by a low pulsing lamp, kept on at all times to maintain humidity. The painting's edges curl inward, but the center, the figures, remain pristine. The children's eyes unblinking, the matriarch's hands folded with impossible precision. Lord Ambrose's lips almost parting. Yet the background decays. Every decade, the walls behind the painted figures darken. Cracks form. The illusion of mildew creeps upward. But no age touches the flesh tones. No dust dulls the eyes. It is as though time has agreed to look away, everywhere but the frame. Archivists report strange things. 1. A young man cataloging early 18th century pigments claimed the painting made his joints ache. Another swore he saw the girl's missing hand, returned but turned palm up. One woman quit her post after hearing a sound like breath behind her, soft and rhythmic, as if someone were being held still just long enough not to die. None of this reached official record. The college calls the portrait an anonymous anomaly, its creator unknown. But behind the frame, faintly scratched, is the letter D. The techniques banned by Parliament did not vanish. They reappeared in quieter forms. In 1842, a boarding school in Dorset was cited for using breath-holding drills as discipline. In 1855, a children's asylum in Yorkshire administered suspended wakefulness, forcing patients to lie still beneath copper sheets for hours. Wax-encased therapy, memory fasting, spine tensioning. All echoes of what began behind the Dunston walls. The methods lived on because they worked, not in healing but in compliance. A child trained to be still was a child easy to forget, easy to frame, easy to call cured when no questions were asked. What the Dunstons began as theology, the worship of motionlessness, became method. Institutions learned that suffering, if dressed in silence, could pass as education, could pass as reform. They took the Dunstons' belief that pain was a preservative and sanitized it with charts, uniforms, and state funding. It no longer needed a locked West Wing. It only needed a locked drawer, a filed report, a signature in blue ink. To this day, no grave bears the name Dunston. No genealogy tracks their blood. And yet, they remain, in the posture of children taught to sit through hunger. In the eyes of patients who stare too long without blinking. In the hands of those who call silence survival. The portrait is not evidence, it is monument. Not to crime, but to a question that no one in power dares to ask aloud. What happens to a soul that is taught not to move? The law may not name them, but history does not forget what it is made of. Bone ash in pigment, fingernails in locket clasps, threads of hair sewn through lips that no longer speak. The Dunstons were never tried, but the world they believed in, where stillness is virtue and pain is art, outlived them. And when asked why, the answer is always the same. There was never proof. But silence, when trained long enough, begins to sound like law. What do you think? Could this happen again? Or has it never truly stopped?